On behalf of the Bildner Center and the Cuba Project, I'd like to welcome everybody here. I'm Julie Skursky. I teach here in the anthropology department and also work on Cuba and the Caribbean. I'm very pleased to welcome two wonderful scholars here today, both of whom have tremendous experience researching Cuba and Cuba's connections with all kinds of other regions of the world. First, I'll introduce Professor Ruth Behar, who teaches in the anthropology department at the University of Michigan. She has worked extensively also in Spain and in Mexico, and has done a great deal of ethnography, which has involved personal narrative. Her works in Cuba include, that involve Cuba, The Vulnerable Observer, Anthropology That Breaks Your Heart, and An Island Called Home, Returning to Jewish Cuba. She's also the editor of a very important and influential collection called Bridges to Cuba, which contains essays by Cubans, both living in Cuba and Cubans who left Cuba at various points in their lives, and about the connections between them. She's the co-editor as well of Women Writing Culture and The Portable Island, Cubans at Home in the World. So as you can see, she has extensive work. I also want to mention in anthropology and particularly related to Cuba, and I want to mention that she's going to be presenting her new volume called Traveling Heavy, Memoir in Between Journeys. And she'll be presenting it tomorrow at NYU's bookstore at 7 o'clock. I believe it's 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock. So that should be a really interesting event. I wanted to add that she also directed a film called Adiós Querida, Goodbye Dear Love, A Cuban Sephardic Journey. And this contained or looked at the life stories of Sephardic Cuban Jews who are living in Cuba, Miami, and New York. Kathleen Lopez, or Kathy Lopez, is a professor at Rutgers, and she teaches in Latino and Hispanic Caribbean studies and also in history. She specializes in the intersections between Asia and Latin America and the Caribbean, and she looks at these historically in all kinds of really interesting and innovative ways. She's particularly interested in post-emancipation societies in the Caribbean, in issues of race and ethnicity more broadly in the Americas, international migration, and the history of the Chinese diaspora, a topic which not many people have really examined, at least in the Americas. She's the author of the recently published book, Chinese Cubans, A Transnational History, and she's also published extensively in various journals. So I welcome them both, and a little minor point, you're welcome to serve yourselves coffee. Apparently it will disappear at 5, and so you might want to take advantage of it. And our first speaker or presenter today will be Ruth Behar.
Thank you. Well, this almost feels like a Michigan reunion here, so it's really an honor to be introduced by Julie Skursky. We were colleagues for many years at the University of Michigan, and Kathy Lopez was a graduate student at the University of Michigan in history, and even though we didn't work together, I knew about your research, so this is really wonderful. I'm sorry? Another Michigan person back there, thank you. So wonderful. And you lived in Michigan. Oh, who else? I mean, this is going to be a reunion. This is great. So, and I want to thank the Bildner Center and the CUNY Grad Center and Mauricio Font and Walfrido for handling all the logistics. And I'm really, really honored to be here. So you can apparently see a slide out here. Is that right? Okay, great. Okay. So let me get started. I have some things written out and then some things that I will more talk to you about. So, although I was only a child, I was part of the exodus of the Jews who fled Cuba for the United States after Fidel Castro came to power in 1959. Jews had settled in Cuba beginning at the turn of the 20th century, and they formed 3 distinct communities. Some slides. So, well, there am I with my mother on the Malecón as a little girl. That's little me, yeah, little me. Another little Ruth there in front of the synagogue, the Patronato Synagogue, which is the main Jewish community center. And that's to show you the departure. That was my grandmother actually leaving Cuba. So there were three communities essentially. There were the American Jewish expatriates who spoke English. There were Ashkenazi Jews who from Poland mainly who spoke Yiddish, and there were Sephardic Jews again largely from Turkey who spoke Ladino or Judeo-Espanol. Pictures, and just to show you, I'm using my own family as an example. This is my Ashkenazi family and my Sephardic family on the other side there. So most of the Jews who'd immigrated from Eastern Europe were seeking eventual entrance to the United States, which had instituted a quota system to limit their presence. Just me, and there's the, so that's the Immigration and Nationality Act that sought to basically limit how many Jews could come into the United States. So these three communities were abuzz with cultural energy before the revolution. Between them, they built 5 synagogues in Havana, 3 synagogues in the provinces, buried their dead in Jewish cemeteries all over the island, and even created Jewish clubs among the palm trees in small towns where they came to feel at home. But when the revolution came and expropriated their small stores and businesses, the majority of Cuba's 15,000 Jews chose to leave and never look back. Only 1,500 chose to stay and live under Castro. Looking at my family's old photographs, I wondered what had become of our lost Jewish home in Cuba. What traces were left of the Jewish presence? The cemeteries, the synagogues, the Torahs, the sacred scrolls. Who was taking care of this legacy? What Jewish memories had managed to survive the years of revolutionary atheism? What had become of the handful of Jews who stayed on the island? Who were they? Why had they chosen to stay? But whenever I expressed my interest, my mother would say, if they stayed in Cuba, it's because they're comunistas. And why would you want to go and meet any comunistas? And she would say comunistas with anger and even a touch of fear. And she would say, be careful, they're smart, and they're going to brainwash you with all their pretty words. But I was a disobedient daughter and a cultural anthropologist, and I wanted not just to hear the stories, but to go back to Cuba and do field work there. So I felt compelled to return to Cuba, find answers to my questions. This is my parents. Okay. So, yeah. So before the '59 revolution, the Jewish community had been a closed community with a strong ethnic and cultural base. The community maintained its own Jewish day schools, restaurants, newspapers, theaters, cultural and social events, Zionist groups, and carefully demarcated identities. And that's why I was showing you the picture of my parents, the carefully demarcated identities, because it was very unusual when they married for an Ashkenazi Jew, my mother, and a Sephardic Jew to marry, but they actually managed it, and it was kind of considered an intermarriage at the time within the Jewish community. So Yiddish, as I said, was spoken by the Ashkenazi Jews. The Sephardic Jews spoke Ladino, but that gradually morphed into Cuban Spanish. But they had a radio program where they would broadcast songs in Ladino that were accompanied by the oud. And at the same time, Jews came to feel very Cuban. They absorbed the culture, the dances, the language, and the spirit of the island. And so the Moishe Pipik is to show you the American Jewish presence in Cuba. That was a restaurant owned by American Jews. And then what was interesting to me is that the community venerated Jose Marti, and here this was a special event in honor of Jose Marti and held in Yiddish. And they went to the Tropicana Club, but again advertised as well in Yiddish. So that was all very interesting. How much they managed to do in a very short time period. They largely arrived in the teens and 20s, and by the 50s they had created this very exuberant culture in Cuba, but definitely frowning upon those who married outside of the tribe. Typically those people were treated as outcasts. The largest numbers of Jews came from Poland, so Jews in Cuba were known as Polacos, and that's a term that's still used today by non-Jews to refer to Jewish Cubans, regardless of their origin. And because many Jewish men were street peddlers in the pre-revolutionary period, Jews were stereotypically cast in the role of peddlers. And this is actually my great-uncle, who was a street peddler, just like my two grandfathers. But as Jews became more settled on the island, they were frequently associated with the cloth trade, or what is known as the shmate business, and with fabric stores on Calle Muralla and surrounding streets in Old Havana. And here are my grandparents, who had a lace store, for those of you that remember, La Habana Vieja, on Calle Aguacate. So there was the occasional association of Jews with intellectual life, as seen in the depiction of the character Hannah, who's a character in Desnoes's film, Memories of Underdevelopment. If you remember it, she's a young woman escaping the Nazis with her family. But overall, Jews were largely perceived in terms of their skills as merchants and business people. It wasn't until after the revolution that Jews came to be associated with Marxist thought and communist practice, though Polish Jews had been present and active during the founding of the Cuban Communist Party in 1925. And for many years, up until his death in the early 90s, it was a Polish Jew, Fabio Grobart, whose original name was Abraham Simchowicz, who would introduce Fidel Castro at assemblies of the Cuban Communist Party. And this is a picture of his son, whose name is also Fabio Grobart, and he's holding up a booklet that has a picture of his father with Fidel's arm around him. After Cuba and the U.S. broke off diplomatic relations in 1961, it was the Canadian Jewish Congress that provided the Jewish community in Cuba with a yearly shipment of Passover foods, and that would include matzah, matzah meal, tuna, oil, tea, horseradish, and wine, sometimes powdered milk. And people had to register to receive these foods. And as the practice of religion declined through the island, the matzah package, that was the last link that most Jews had that maintained their link to their heritage. Those who went to the trouble to pick up the package at the main synagogue in Havana, at the Patronato, usually were no longer celebrating a Passover Seder. They didn't tell their children the story of why Jews ate matzah for a week. Still, the taste of the Jewish bread of affliction stayed on their tongues and reminded them of a secret history. The loss of 90% of the Jewish population following the revolution decimated the community and made it difficult to maintain Jewish life on the island. But Judaism and Jewish identity never vanished. Through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the heyday of the revolution, the synagogues in Havana still functioned with the participation of Jewish elders. The elders had nothing to lose by participating in the rituals, but their children and grandchildren had to abstain because university education and professional jobs were withheld from those who had religious affiliations. There were synagogues that shut down in the provinces, in Santa Clara, Camagüey, and Santiago de Cuba, because there simply weren't enough participants to keep them going. The keys were handed over to the Cuban government, and the buildings were turned over to other uses. Eventually, these three synagogues would build new synagogues, and the synagogue in Santiago is actually in its original location, following the Jewish revitalization that I'll talk about in a moment that started taking off in the 90s during this special period. Several of the Jews who stayed participated actively in the revolution and the revolutionary government, but the vast majority sought to assimilate quietly. Between the 60s and 80s, the Jews chose, like most other Cubans, to underplay whatever made them different, ethnically or culturally, in order to integrate into the revolutionary process and its ideology of national unity. Diversity, whether of sexual orientation, religious faith, or cultural identity, was strongly suppressed in those years, as is well known. Homophobia was rampant. You didn't see Santeria initiates dressed all in white, as you do today on the streets of Cuba, and young people didn't wear a crucifix or a Jewish star in public. Jewish identity traditionally is considered a question of genealogy, of being born of a Jewish mother's womb, and from that perspective, there are only a handful of Jews who can claim Jewish ancestry on both their mother's and father's sides of the family. Most Jews in Cuba after the revolution were children of Jewish men, sometimes Jewish women, who'd married non-Jewish Cubans, and they in turn went on to marry yet another generation of non-Jews. Jewish identity became diluted in this period, and in addition, before the 90s, families that could claim a Jewish heritage were scattered throughout Havana and the provinces, and it was very difficult for them to come together and forge a community because of problems with transportation and limited communication. So Jewish religious and cultural education wasn't available between the 60s and 80s, and elders who might have passed on cultural traditions grew old and died, and there were no young people to take their place. Yet, I don't want to make this picture sound gloomy. Looking at the situation from a different perspective, Jewish identity also was enriched by being mixed with other identities and thereby became part of the famous Cuban ajiaco, the famous Cuban stew. With only a handful of Jews keeping up religious practices before the 90s, they developed what became known as the Cuban minyan. In normal circumstances, the minyan consists of a quorum of 10 Jewish adults. In the Orthodox tradition of Judaism, it is 10 Jewish men. The minyan is the minimum number of Jews needed to carry out a complete religious service. But in Cuba, for a long time, the minyan consisted of however many Jews were present, sometimes it was just 3 or 4, however many Torahs or sacred scrolls were needed to fill in for people, and God, of course, the 10th. There were just enough participants and there was just enough Jewish memory for the withering Jewish community to become the seed for a revitalization that now seems totally astonishing. The prospects for revitalization had looked dim, except to Dr. Jose Miller, a dental surgeon born and raised in the country town of Yaguajay, who took over the presidency of the Jewish community in the 1970s. A religious awakening began in Cuba after the fall of the Soviet Union, and that gave Dr. Miller the confidence to believe that a Jewish revival was possible. And many of you probably know that in 1991, the Castro government declared that members of the Communist Party could have religious affiliations if they chose, and the Cuban Constitution was also changed in 1992, declaring that the country would no longer be atheist but secular. Religious services and outward devotion to God became fully acceptable. Temples, churches, and synagogues opened their doors wide, and people could be seen in the streets of Cuba wearing crucifixes, Jewish stars, and dressed in white from head to toe after initiation into Santeria. In response to Cuba's willingness to allow God to return to the island, the U.S. government decided to offer a carrot by encouraging humanitarian and religious missions that brought not only Bibles and aspirin, but badly needed medical supplies, powdered milk, clothes, computers, and other goods that helped Cuba cope with the economic crisis set in motion by the loss of Soviet subsidies. Now there's Dr. Miller. This religious opening took place as other kinds of people-to-people humanitarian, medical, and cultural travel were also newly permitted, leading to what I've called the Cuba boom, with numerous American travelers going to the island to discover and consume Cuban art, music, and spirituality, creating new transnational networks of consumption for everything Cuban. I'll show you some slides in a moment of that. Under these changed circumstances, Dr. Miller called upon the Joint Distribution Committee in New York to support a Jewish revitalization in Cuba and received a positive reply. But even a charismatic leader like Dr. Miller didn't foresee the full impact that the presence of El Joint, as Cubans call the JDC, would have in Cuba. By the time of Miller's death in 2006, the Jewish community would completely reinvent itself. From a withering community, it would be transformed into a showcase for the miracle, as it's called, of Jewish survival in Castro's Cuba. The Jews of Cuba would move to center stage in the imagination of American Jews, occupying the role of a lost tribe that needed to be saved and returned to the fold of the world Jewish community. So once El Joint found its way to Cuba, other Jewish organizations followed. B'nai B'rith, Ort, Hadassah, the Lubavitch of Canada and Argentina, the Jewish conservative movement, they all wanted a place at the table in Jewish Cuba. American synagogues adopted Jewish communities on the island as sister temples. Campus Hillel organizations promoted Cuba as the new hip place to go on social justice missions. Synagogues all over the U.S. organized trips to help the Jews of Cuba to survive through donations of food, medicine, clothes, and books, as well as through Jewish education. Exact numbers are difficult to find, but certainly several thousand American Jews have traveled to Cuba since the early 90s on religious missions, and they continue to travel there consistently. And well, here's an example of one. Brochures and websites advertising Jewish Cuban outreach programs always make two pitches: to aid the Jewish rebirth and allow American Jews to experience Cuba while, quote, being more than a tourist. These missions to Cuba play an important unifying role for American Jews who in the last 30 years have become increasingly divided among themselves. Conflicts have arisen over the meaning of Jewishness and the relationship between Jews and the diaspora and the State of Israel. For nearly 2 millennia, Jews were a diasporic people living in many lands until 1900, when more than 80% of world Jewry lived in Europe. After the Holocaust, that 80% became split between the U.S. and Israel. Where Israel was once seen as the center of the Jewish world, now American Jews have started to call for a relationship among equals. More radical voices are challenging the split between Jewish homeland and Jewish diaspora and calling for a vision of global Jews who feel that their sense of identity isn't based in nationalistic desires for land, but a claim to cultural heritage in diverse diaspora locations, from New York to Moscow, from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Jerusalem to the high-rise apartments near Aventura Mall in Miami. In the midst of what appears to be a homogenizing globalization, there is a more intense longing for Jewish multiculturalism. Never has there been so deep a fascination with the most far-flung branches of the Jewish diaspora. Never has there been so strong a desire among American Jews to reclaim the most obscure Jewish communities that have endured in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Cuba enters into this changing panorama of American Jewish identity just at the moment when philanthropy becomes one of the most important means of anchoring that identity in the goal of rescue and salvage of Jewish cultures around the world. In Cuba, American Jews can simultaneously hold on to the idea the Jews are one people, and the opposite idea, the Jews are a multicultural people making their home in many parts of the world. Uncertain though they may be about their own Jewishness, Cuba proves to be a fulfilling destination where it is possible to witness and aid the rebirth, renaissance, and renewal of a needy Jewish community in a country that is so close but may as well be at the end of the world, sometimes because of the U.S. embargo. And I would add also that there are no sorrowful Holocaust memories to be found in Cuba, as in Poland, for example, another frequent destination for Jewish travel. The American Jewish givers derive tremendous emotional satisfaction from their giving, as can be seen in numerous testimonials. Stanley Falkenstein, who's traveled to Cuba more than 30 times from California, bringing wheelchairs and eyeglasses, was able to articulate feelings shared by many other American Jews. As he states in a 2005 open letter to the Jewish community of Cuba, "You have given me the best gift I have ever received in my life. I have found in you the meaning and purpose of my life." American Jews who travel to Cuba are willing to put aside any doubts they might have about communism in Cuba and the continuing restrictions on freedom of speech. Jaime Suchliki, a Cuban Jewish historian based in Miami, thinks American Jews are naive and engaging in a game of self-deception. Quote, "The American Jewish community uses a visit to Cuba as an excuse to do a junket," he declares. After a visit to a Havana synagogue, he says, they can then say, "I have helped Cuban Jews." At this moment, there are numerous Jewish Cuba package tours available to American travelers. just wanted to show you as well that the opening to Cuba, of course, begins in the 90s, and this 1999 National Geographic article is very significant. Buena Vista Social Club, of course, another aspect of the opening, and even Ann Arbor has a Cuba craze, and of course I am included in that. Okay, so there's been a huge rise in the number of tours to Cuba in the last 5 years since Fidel has stepped down and Raul Castro has taken over, and many of these go to visit the Jews in Cuba. You have major powerhouses like the Smithsonian Museum and the Metropolitan Museum of Art that are now part of this congested scene of group travel to Cuba. Even though they don't specifically focus on Jewish travel, they frequently include a stop at the synagogue. And apparently there's a huge audience for specifically Jewish Cuba travel, judging from the wide number of programs that are now available, and I'll show you some of them. So Cuba Tours and Travels lets us know that Cuba's faithful want and need your help. B'nai B'rith remains actively involved in Jewish-Cuban missions. The Cuban-American Jewish Mission, one of the original providers of Jewish-Cuban travel, seeks to remain in business, advertising that they can bring travelers to the real Jewish Cuba. The JCC in San Francisco has its regular Jewish Cuba travel program, and it's led by an Argentinian Jew, and they've now added the Bay of Pigs to their itinerary, since sites of uneasy history eventually become seductive tourist sites. Batia Plunge, who has worked for 10 years with the Havana tour guide Alexis Hernandez, has gone into business with him to create exclusive travel programs. Entwine, with its youthful Jewish leaders, seeks to gain access to young Jewish travelers wanting to go to Cuba, advertising via Facebook. In turn, the former Elder Hostel organization, now consolidated under Rhodes Scholar, has a program called Shalom Cuba, bringing those interested in lifelong learning to a communion with the Jews of Cuba. Among the newcomers to this market is an organization called Jewish Cuba Tours, offering the possibility of experiencing the true spirit of Cuba and its Jewish people. Now, as a student of anthropology, 70s and 80s, I was assigned to read many books about quote-unquote exotic people, usually in New Guinea or Africa, but I never thought my people, the Jews of Cuba, would come to be considered this exotic. Initially, when I started spending time with Jews in Cuba in the early 90s, there were very few books or films about them, no photographs on websites. There was the movie Hotel Cuba, produced by 2 historians, but most of the information was about the past. By the mid-90s, books, articles, and films began to appear, and now, as you can see, there's an explosion of information about the Jews of Cuba. And the information ranges from scholarly to popular and can include articles in the travel section of the New York Times. So this avalanche of attention has turned the Jews of Cuba into an overstudied, overobserved, and overphotographed tribe, scrutinized by a never-ending stream of tourists, missionaries, writers, filmmakers, and well-wishers. Sometimes I despair at what has happened to my people on the island. Sometimes, I have to confess, I'm jealous of all these American travel organizers who've managed to create a lucrative business out of Jewish travel to Cuba. Why didn't I think of that? Yet I know I'm complicit with this Jewish Cuba craze. My book, An Island Called Home, published in 2007, and my former publicist is here, is read by many participants of Jewish Cuba tours, and in fact, you might find this interesting. Some of the travelers use my book as a kind of guidebook, and they will seek out the people that I write about in the book and ask them to autograph the pages where their stories appear. So the nature of the American fascination with Cuba's Jews, I think, has a lot to do with a desire to find an intersection of Jewishness and revolutionary idealism. And I worked with photographer Humberto Mayol, who provided photographs for my book, and we kept trying to find visually a way of revealing this conjuncture. And I think this is one of his best pictures because it literally feels as if Che, the icon of revolution, is inside the synagogue. So the idea that Jewish life has been possible under Fidel Castro and now Raul Castro contributes to this exotic appeal of Cuba's Jews who maintain their identity in a web of contradictions and paradoxes. Since Israel votes with the U.S. to maintain the embargo, Cuba is officially pro-Palestinian and doesn't have diplomatic relations with Israel. Yet Israel, together with Spain, is a major investor in the Cuban economy. Jews in Cuba suffer no discrimination, quite the opposite. The Cuban government goes out of its way to accommodate Jewish needs, neither interfering with the functioning of the kosher butcher shop in Havana, nor the distribution of matzah, which now comes in large quantities, neither interfering with the activities that go on in the synagogues, nor the numerous departures of community members to Israel, and many have left and many continue to leave, and their travel expenses are covered by the Israeli government, and they also receive a subsidy once they arrive in Israel. So although the Cuban press frequently expresses anti-Zionist views, there is wide admiration and respect for the Jewish people. Schindler's List was shown on Cuban television and was the subject of much sympathetic discussion. It has not escaped the notice of the Cuban government that American Jews have fueled the revitalization of the Jewish community. They have also been among the most active grassroots diplomats engaging with Cubans through cultural exchanges and volunteer medical assistance programs. And also, it's interesting that many American Jews are involved as art collectors, bringing Cuban art to New York, LA, and Miami. Fidel Castro, some say, has a soft spot for the Jews, possibly for personal reasons. Might Castro be a hidden Jew? His daughter, Alina Fernandez, claims that one of Castro's grandfathers was a Jew from Turkey. But all that Castro has ever told reporters is that his Jewish identity harks back to the days of the Inquisition, when Spanish Jews took on names like Castro and became conversos to escape being burnt at the stake. Irrespective of Castro's family tree, Cubans as a whole like to think of themselves as the Jews of the Caribbean. I've heard that many times. Cuba and Israel are similarly fierce and independent nations, small in size but huge in ambitions, surrounded by historical enemies who seek to topple their efforts to build paradise. Cuban exiles, it is also worth noting, see themselves as diasporic in the classical Jewish sense, in the words of poet Rafael Campo, as people of a solitary star who wander searching for a home someplace. And I think it's no accident that Gustavo Pérez Firmat titled his memoir Next Year in Havana, echoing the Jewish refrain that we say at Passover, next year in Jerusalem. Such shared Jewish and Cuban sensibilities make the actual Jews still living in Cuba a potent symbol of what it means to search for home in the world. Jews in Cuba have come to represent something larger than themselves. They are Jews in an outpost of civilization, Jews still forging a life in the last of the communist lands, Jews close and yet far from the US, Jews who breathe the revolutionary air of Che Guevara, Jews shockingly poor in material things, lacking such basic instruments of modern life, often as credit cards and frequent flyer numbers, but who appear to be rich in spirituality and cultural heritage. Their aura is such that numerous American Jews continue to travel to Cuba to show their support and feel the joy of communing with them. The fact that celebrity visitors are drawn to the Jews in Cuba has turned them into celebrities as well. Steven Spielberg, the Hollywood filmmaker, felt compelled to visit with the Jews while in Havana for a festival of his films in 2002. Before leaving, he wrote the Jews of Cuba a note. When I see how much cultural restoration has been performed by you and others, it reminds me again about why I am so proud to be a Jew. He added the words, "Thank you," before signing his name, as if to express his gratitude to the Jews in Cuba for simply existing. So in my research on the Jews of Cuba, I made it a point to try to understand the diverse individuals who form part of the community, learning both about the lives of those who participate in these interchanges with tourists and those who remain uninvolved, looking at the key players as well as those who are critical of the way the community interacts with foreigners. So I'm going to try in the remaining time that I have very quickly to share some of these stories so that you know a little bit about some of the protagonists and their trajectories. That's again the Patronato Synagogue in Havana. and Adela Dworin, who's many of you here may know. And she is very much the face and voice of the Jews of Cuba, the leader of the community, very charismatic person, and she speaks Yiddish, English, and Spanish, and will use all of those languages. Different groups cycle through the synagogue, sometimes several groups a day, and she always is the one that does the briefing, as they call it. And one of the things, here she is showing some people into the synagogue. And one of the things that makes her so charming is she's just not celebrity conscious at all. So that when Steve Tisch appeared, at the Patronato, she had to be told who he was. She didn't realize he was the co-owner of the Giants and, movie producer and so on. So, and that's just something that is so charming about her. And for the first time ever, a Jewish delegation went to the Maccabean Games in Israel this summer, and they needed uniforms. And so she asked him, Mr. Tisch, to provide the uniforms, and of course he did. I'm going to go through these somewhat quickly. Rosa Behar, who's the head of the pharmacy at the Patronato and has also been the leader of the Hadassah chapter in Cuba for many years. And here she is actually in the synagogue, and she distributes all of these medical goods that are brought to the synagogue to be donated. And they have so many that they donate them to hospitals throughout Cuba. Alberto Behar, not my relative, and Rosa isn't either, but we pretend to be. And he is now the person that prepares children for their bar and bat mitzvah, and he has a very interesting story because his father was a revolutionary, and his mother wasn't Jewish, his father, so he's Jewish from his father's family. And when his father was dying, his father said to him that he wanted to be buried in the Jewish cemetery. And this was shocking to Alberto because his father had always been revolutionary and not religious at all. And he said, but why? Why does that matter to you? And he said, well, that's where all my family is buried, and that's where I want to be with the Jews. And so that was like an eye-opening experience for Alberto. And at the funeral, he was told that he had to say Kaddish, which is the mourner's prayer, but he didn't even know what that was. And so he began, really without knowing a thing, and now is the one of the educational leaders in the community. Ida Gudstad is an amazing person. She's the daughter of an Auschwitz survivor. She's now very active in the Patronato, and she's holding up the passport that her mother and her older sister used to travel to Cuba, to immigrate to Cuba. Oh, and this is the uniform that her father wore in the camp that he brought with him to Cuba. And a very different example here, this is Ernesto Altschuler with Jose Altschuler, whose back is turned to us. And this is a son and father. They're both very active revolutionaries. They're both scientists. They're both professors at the University of Havana, and they very much stay apart from the community. They're not interested in being involved religiously, and they're not interested in being part of that whole encounter with foreigners. Jaime Gans Green, that was an amazing experience getting to meet him. He's the last Jew in the town of Palma Soriano in the eastern end of Cuba, right near Santiago de Cuba, and it was really an incredible experience to get to know him because he had all these documents of the Jewish past, many of them family documents that he had held on to and never shown anybody until I came along. And this was one of the more shocking things that he showed us was this postcard apparently sent from a concentration camp with Hitler stamps on it. David Tacher, he's a community leader in Santa Clara, and he's photographed right near the mausoleum, the monument to Che, and he's been very, very active. He calls himself a born-again Jew, and again, he's a person who was brought up non-religiously, with very revolutionary parents, and now he has actually just finished constructing a new synagogue in Santa Clara. And he also, to add, he also had a Holocaust memorial built in the cemetery, in the Jewish cemetery in Santa Clara. So I can only be very brief here. This is a young woman, Danaida, whose story I've been following for many, many years. She's about 22 now. And I have a long essay about her in my new book, Traveling Heavy. And so I started thinking about her story when she was very young in the 90s. She was born in 1989. And a very interesting story. Her father was the leader of the Sephardic community throughout the 90s and into the 2000s, and he is a Sephardic Jew, and she is a mix of Sephardic on his side and Afro-Cuban on her mother's side, and her mother is also a Jehovah's Witness. And what was very interesting is Danaida was brought up Jewish by her father, but she always lived with her mother. And so her mother is a Jehovah's Witness, and then her older sister, who I'll talk about in a minute, her older sister is a Santera. So she grew up literally with three religions, which is just this Cuban transculturation that we often talk about. So here she is at the synagogue with her father, and he was the one that prepared her for her bat mitzvah, but she always dreamed of leaving for Israel from around the time of 12 when I started interviewing her. And this is her older sister, and her older sister, who is not only a santera, but she's also a salsa singer and performer, and she appears in my movie, Adiós Querida. It turned out that at one point she was performing at a club in La Rampa, and basically there was this guy was there, this guy dressed in black. He was kind of like scouting for talent in Cuba, and thought she was very talented, and asked her if she would want to go to Europe, and she said yes, and she is now in Poland. So this is a salsa group in Poland, and so she initially began with this group as the only woman, and then eventually got tired of that and created her own salsa group in Poland, and you see her here in the middle. So these letters and stories were arriving in Cuba from her older sister Omni, telling her, that things were good, that that it was good to be an immigrant, and so on, and that even more made Danaida want to eventually leave Cuba. Here's Omni, and so I went to see her shortly before leaving Cuba, now 6 years ago. At the time, she'd just gotten her passport. She'd never traveled anywhere. And she was briefly married to this man that she's photographed with, and they traveled to Cuba together. And here's some pictures of her departure from Cuba. And you notice they dressed in white, saying goodbye to her mother, who couldn't go with her mother not being Jewish, and so on. Couldn't go, and that was really something that was very, very heartbreaking for Danaida. And so this is one of the first emails that she sent me. We'd never been in touch via email because she didn't have access to a computer, and it's very, very hard to get access to the internet in Cuba. And then as soon as she got to Israel, I started communicating with her via email. And then eventually I was able to go to Israel and meet up with her and her father, who were living there, and her father now in Israel, living in Beersheba, to say. And so this was a couple of years ago, and found them in Beersheba. But Danaida was still, in some ways, still looking for the right place, and she started having some doubts. She experienced some racism in Cuba. People didn't know what to make of her. They often took her for Arab, and she didn't like that. She'd say, no, I'm Cubana, but she'd be taken for Bedouin or Arab or Ethiopian, and that bothered her. And so she went to Spain for a while. She went to Spain for about 8 months, and she was selling Dead Sea products in Spain. That's the picture she took of herself. And while there, very interesting story, I'll tell you the story here. She ends up meeting this man, Junior. And Junior is a Dominicano from the DR. They met in Spain. He went back to the DR. She went back to Israel. They were communicating back and forth via Facebook and so on. And then she finally went to the DR, and it looked like she was going to stay there. When I wrote my essay about her, it looked like she was going to stay there. They had a baby. And now they are all in Israel, and so I was able to be in Israel again this summer, and got to see her and meet Junior and meet her baby daughter, and of course her father is there as well. And what's so amazing is that she's just such a determined young woman, and her big dream was to eventually get her mother to Israel, and her mother is now visiting them in Israel, and if she wants to stay, she might stay. The interesting thing is that her parents are divorced, and they're all sharing one house at the moment. And Danaida is an incredibly hard worker. It's really amazing how hard she works. She works several jobs, day and night jobs, to really keep the whole family together. So I wanted to just briefly share with you, since this is a community that the missions and the Jewish groups don't go and visit, and that's the Jewish Cuban community in Miami. And this is not a community that that is visited, and I'm now at work on a new book about this community, also working with a photographer, and it may be called, maybe some of you can give me a better title later, but at the moment I'm calling it El Grupo, How the Cuban Jews Found Home Again in Miami. And so I've been talking to many Cuban Jews in Miami. This is Ophelia, who runs the Ashkenazi synagogue, runs administratively the synagogue there. These are the Sephardic women from Temple Moses who make borrecas and bulemas and so on and sell them, and that helps to support the synagogue. And I just wanted to share with you these recipes. This is a recipe for gefilte fish that my grandmother wrote in Spanish, and I always love the fact that the gefilte fish is written out in Spanish with a couple of words there in English, yellowfish and so on. And this is my mother's recipe for frijoles negros. So that combination of gefilte fish and frijoles negros, very much the combination with which I grew up. And so just there's some amazing stories in Miami, and I'm glad I'm having a chance to find out about them. This is a shoe repairman whose daughter actually is an extremely wealthy real estate agent, but he continues to want to repair shoes, and he does, and he has this wonderful sign, Se habla Yiddish, in the store. It doesn't matter how old some of the members of the community are, they still like to go and dance salsa on Saturday nights, play dominoes, so there's all the Cuban stuff. Bernardo Benes, who many of you may have heard of, who was very active in discussions with Fidel Castro in the late 70s, and here he is shown with a Torah that he actually brought from Cuba back to Miami. And then I want to show you some of the women, because the women in the community are really interesting. This is a woman who opened up her store called On My Own after her husband left her. So interesting story. Elsa Habib, who sells the Good Luck Evil Eye charms from Turkey at her store in Miami. Another woman who inherited her father's fabric store in Miami. Some of the women have chosen to become Orthodox now, quite religious as this woman has. This is a woman who is a Sephardic singer, also shares my last name. Another woman who does Middle Eastern dancing. And this young woman who I found very interesting, who I met at the University of Miami, who was the head of the Federation of Cuban Students at the University of Miami. She's a Cuban Jewish young woman. So I was really I'm really interested in all these combinations of Cuban and Jewishness that I'm finding in Miami. So to end, as I said, missions and Jewish groups don't go to Miami to visit with the Jewish Cubans. They're not exotic enough. There's no class difference to allow for charity and philanthropy. In fact, this is a community of great wealth, and you can say that in this community, largely the American dream has been fulfilled, though this community was forced to accept charity when they first arrived in Miami, and now they feel very proud that they are givers. Okay, so to go on from there, and many of these Cuban Jews in Miami have gone back in recent years to see their homes, the synagogues, and the Jewish cemeteries. All right, so now to conclude, so despite the existence of this very large community in Miami, I think the Jewish community on the island is always the bedrock. It's where the story begins. Story of an immigration that was a detour on the way to the U.S. and became a settlement that appeared it would be permanent. Now this community is a site for Jewish storytelling, Jewish projections, and Jewish performances, a site for crisscrossing needs and desires, a place where charity goes a long way and is gratefully received, a place for Americans sometimes to atone for the continuing U.S. embargo. Until political relations between the U.S. and Cuba are normalized, the Jews who remain in Cuba, I think, will continue to be seen as an exotic people, at once strange and admirable creatures, a people who have chosen otherness. In this way, the Jews in Cuba provide a service to Cuba itself, helping to support a positive image of the island's tolerance and goodwill to the Jews. In turn, they fulfill the burning wish of all Jews, never to disappear. Thank you.
I'd also like to thank, of course, the Bildner Center, Mauricio Font, and Walfredo, especially for organizing this, and also Ruth Behar and Julie Skursky, who, as we mentioned, we all were at Michigan at one point, and they, without maybe knowing it, were also very formative in my graduate training. And Mauricio also, I think everything that appears in my book on Chinese Cubans was kind of tested out here in kind of raw form. So I think my first presentation here was in 2000 or something. So it's been over a decade that I've been testing things out. So I'm not going to pretend that today what I'm presenting is any more polished. But you'll find what I'm going to give to you today is as a way of examining the question of the other in Cuban national identity. I'll do that through two life stories of two Chinese migrants. Together they span the history of the Chinese in Cuba from the middle of the 19th century to the present day. So for those who are unfamiliar with Chinese Cuban history, this is just a brief outline that gives you the basic time frame. First, the coolie trade to Cuba, in which close to 150,000 Chinese came as indentured laborers to work in sugar plantations, both during and after the abolition of slavery. So, and then the post-indenture period in the 1880s and 1890s was when about half of the Chinese, because they were treated so abominably, actually died on the plantations or on the journey over. The remaining half, although they were promised return passage home, never got it. And they ended up staying on the plantations and eventually migrating off and starting small businesses. And they were joined by Chinese who came from California, who were merchants, came with capital, so immediately a different kind of class structure developed. And also Chinese who came directly from China. So that's the late 19th century. In Republican Cuba, which was 1902 to 1959 when the revolution happened, the second major wave of Chinese migrants came. And this was tens of thousands that came around World War I to cut sugarcane. And then the two major revolutions, the Chinese Revolution of 1949, which was a communist revolution causing middle-class landlords to flee all over the world, but especially Taiwan, Hong Kong, the United States, and Cuba. And also the 1959 Cuban Revolution, when some of those same merchants who had come 10 years earlier now fled to places such as Miami and Union City. And that kind of parallels the migration of exiles that Ruth Behar talked about. And then also the special period where we have a similar kind of process of revitalization of the Chinese community and renewed ties between the People's Republic of China and the government of Cuba. So I'll begin by the first migration story that I'm going to talk about today, which is an indentured laborer whose name was Dong Gong Chung. And he joined the 142 official count of men from southeastern Guangdong province who were recruited as indentured laborers for Cuban sugar plantations. The atrocities of this system so closely resembled the Atlantic slave trade that Cuban historians call it the trata amarilla, or yellow trade. In 1959, he was kidnapped and taken to the Spanish Caribbean colony of Cuba as part of this infamous coolie trade. He signed a contract of indenture that obligated him to work for 8 years at a sugar estate in Matanzas province. There he was baptized and given the name Pastor Pelayo, which was after the Cuban planter who held his contract. After completing his term of service, he was forced to recontract for another 8 years. By the time he finished his indenture and the indentured labor period was over, which was 1874, Pelayo was in his 30s, and he had no hope or resources to return to China. So like slaves who were now coming out of slavery during this long emancipation process in Cuba, he migrated eastward to the sugar districts of central Cuba. There he moved from estate to estate and earned wages as part of a labor gang. He eventually became a labor contractor himself for both Chinese and black workers. Former indentured Chinese laborers like Pastor Pelayo came into daily contact with enslaved African men and women who were also on the cusp of emancipation. Pelayo managed to accumulate enough money to purchase freedom for a domestic slave. They entered into a common law union and had 9 children together, who they raised among a network of people of Chinese and African descent in the town of Cienfuegos. So for the baptism of their first son in 1881, we can imagine the gathering at the baptismal font. The godparents were chosen by each side of the family, a Chinese man and a mulatta woman named Elena. So they no longer needed priests or white masters to serve as godparents. Instead, they relied on their own social networks that were being built up. Although they were of different racial, ethnic, and cultural backgrounds, their common experiences on Santa Clara sugar estates brought this group together for the baptism. Pastor Pelayo himself emerged as a leader among the local Chinese in Cienfuegos. He established among these Chinese who participated in the independence wars were second-generation children of Chinese men and Cuban women who may have had varying degrees of a Chinese identity. So that's who you see pictured here. His name was Ramon Estrada, and he had a Chinese father and a Cuban mother. Both Pastor Pelayo and his son supported the final war for independence from Spain in 1895, and they registered as eligible voters after the establishment of the new Cuban Republic. In 1913, Pastor Pelayo died in Cienfuegos, and he was insolvent due to a gambling habit. And he's buried today at La Reina Cemetery in Cienfuegos, and most of it is inundated with water and overgrown with weeds, at least the area, the part of the cemetery that was reserved for people of his class. During the 20th century came the next major wave of Chinese migrants to Cuba. But first we have the U.S. occupation of Cuba from 1899 to 1902. The U.S., if you recall, had Chinese exclusion acts from 1882 all the way through 1943. And so they were afraid that Chinese would use Cuba as a stepping stone to go north. So when they occupied Cuba, they refused to leave unless Cuba would accept their own exclusion law for Chinese. And this was applied in 1902. And it was kind of enforced with varying degrees of success, but it was on the books all the way up through World War II. However, there was an exception, and that was around 1917. Planters demanded workers, especially foreign workers, to help boost sugar production. This time, Chinese migrants who came were no longer indentured laborers who were bound by contracts and given Spanish surnames and forced to be baptized. Rather, they came as free men who may have initially worked in the sugar industry but quickly moved into other occupations. But like the 19th century, this migration was also male, largely male, and so it led to a high degree of mixed marriages, and I think much higher than the kinds of intermarriages that Ruth Behar talked about. Among this second wave of migrants was a man named Lue Fan, who in 1918, at age 18, emigrated from his village in Xinhui County, Guangdong Province. And so that's what you see here. This is Guangdong Province, but even within Guangdong, the Chinese migrants came primarily from 2 counties, Taishan and Xinhui. And the Taishan, or Toisan in Cantonese, are the same migrants that came to the United States during this time. So it's a very localized migration. Lue Fan made his living peddling vegetables in the town of Cienfuegos. So he became a familiar sight in his Cuban neighborhood, where he carried 2 baskets on a bamboo pole and went door to door, and later had a cart. He also became known as Francisco Luis. A decade passed before Lue Fan made his first return trip to his home village in China, and there he built a new house and married. He made 2 other return trips in total, and he had 2 daughters, and he never saw his second daughter in person. But from Cuba, he gave her the name Mali, after the Western name Maria or Mary. He never again returned to China and left his 2 daughters to grow up in the village without their father, which was actually a common occurrence. Both of them both of his daughters eventually married and had children of their own and moved into their husbands' houses, but they always maintained their father's ancestral home in the village in China. Back in Cuba, Francisco Luis developed a relationship with a Cuban woman, and they also had 2 daughters named Lourdes and Violeta. He gave each of them a Chinese name, Gui Gui and Gui Po. So in this image, which became the inspiration for the cover of my book, you can see on their school bags, he has their Chinese characters inscribed for their names. And he always kind of instilled some of the Chinese traditions in them, although they didn't grow up speaking Chinese, because they were raised mostly for the first 3 years by their mother, and then afterward, their Cuban mother, and then afterward kind of in these Catholic schools. So after 3 years, their mother abandoned the family, and Luis Fan, Francisco Luis, raised his 2 Cuban daughters on his own while he continued to support his Trans-Pacific Chinese family. The thing that I found unique about this family as opposed to other lives that I followed was that he encouraged a relationship between his Cuban daughters and his Chinese daughters by having them send photos and write letters back and forth. And he would write the letters in Chinese on behalf of his Cuban daughters. His Cuban daughters always thought that they were corresponding with Chinese cousins. But from the beginning, his Chinese daughters, who were older and were kind of very familiar with this phenomenon of trans-Pacific families, they knew that they had half-sisters in Cuba, and they referred to them as third sister or Sanmei, and fourth sister, Simei. Luis Fan did not have Cuban citizenship, but he was considered Cuban by all of the neighbors in Cienfuegos. But he also, at the same time, maintained Chinese sensibilities and Chinese attachments. He belonged to a fraternal organization and a Chinese occupational guild. He read Chinese newspapers. He donated to China's resistance against the Japanese occupation during World War II. He attended Cantonese opera performances, and to many of these things he brought his 2 Cuban daughters. And by this time, Havana's Chinatown was booming, but Chinese establishments really could be found across the island, from provincial capitals to small towns. And so this is an example of one of the major transnational firms that had branches in Lima, Peru, in Hong Kong, in San Francisco, in Havana, and even a branch in Cienfuegos. So the early 1930s, the same time that Luis Fan was making return trips and sending remittances home, it was also a period of intense nativist sentiment and politics in Cuba. And so there was kind of a renewed specifically directed at anti-Chinese racism during this period that showed up mostly in newspaper discourse, but also in some of the laws, which ostensibly were directed toward all foreigners, but at times were more directly applied to Chinese. The other targeted groups, of course, were Jewish and Haitians, especially West Indians. The Chinese merchant community, which was very well established by this time, countered these attacks through their own Chinese press. And so this is their magazine called Fraternidad, and it was a bilingual Chinese-Spanish newspaper. So it was intended to reach both audiences, the Chinese merchant community, but also those of mixed descent who would consider themselves part of the Chinese community. And even further than that, it was intended to be, someone who is a Cuban merchant could pick it up and see what's happening in the Chinese community. And it really emphasized things like intermarriage and baptism. You saw in that previous slide the kind of parallels that they made between Jose Marti and Sun Yat-sen. But also they, in the social pages, they really highlighted these intermarriages between Chinese and Cubans. After Francisco Luis died in 1975, communication between the 4 sisters stopped for over a quarter of a century. And so these 2 stories are just 2 of the lives that produced the complex, multifaceted Chinese community over the course of a century. And the book further examines the transnational history of these migrants and their multiple identities as Chinese and Cuban. Whether indentured or free, most migrants ultimately aim to accumulate resources and go back to China rather than settle permanently in Cuba. But in the 19th century, the coerced nature of the coolie system left almost no possibility for return. In the Republican period, free Chinese migrants worked to maintain transnational ties to China, but many of them came to identify themselves as Cuban. So in considering ethnic minorities in Cuba in general, one thing that I want to highlight is that the Chinese in Cuba, despite moments of intense racism and anti-Chinese discourse, the Chinese in Cuba did not experience institutionalized discrimination to the same extent as those in the United States, where they were officially excluded, or Mexico, where anti-Chinese campaigns led to their violent expulsion from northern Sonora in 1931, or places like Peru and Jamaica, which throughout the 19th and 20th century had specifically anti-Chinese riots where hundreds of Chinese died. Rather, I argue that Chinese participation in the Cuban Wars for Independence, their successful formation of cross-racial alliances, and the professed dedication of the Cuban Republic to an ideal of racial democracy created conditions for their incorporation into the national citizenry. I'm going to skip to the epilogue of my book, where I discuss what's happening since the early 1990s. And this parallels a lot with what Professor Behar discussed, which is the revitalization of different ethnic groups across Cuba, among them the Chinese. And so this is the Barrio Chino, or Chinatown in Havana today, which is accompanied by festivals where academics can join and present papers, but also Cubans from across the island have come and shared their own migration stories. And so it's been kind of a wonderful resource for capturing these stories that would otherwise be lost. When we speak about Chinese Cuba today, it's really speaking about people of mixed descent. There is only about 150 ethnic Chinese left from those original migrations. And if you go to Cuba, if you've been there recently, you'll also notice an infusion of new Chinese. And these are mostly temporary students and entrepreneurs that are coming. The one thing that you haven't seen is kind of a new permanent streams of migration, because it still is not economically viable for investment in Cuba. And Chinese basically in the past have come to invest in the Chinatown. And then to follow up on some of the impact that this revitalization has had on these two families that I trace. During my first research trip to Cuba back in 1999, I learned the story of the indentured laborer Pastor Pelayo when I met his two grandsons in Cienfuegos. And so they're Afro-Cuban, and they strongly identify with their African heritage, but especially Blas Pelayo, who had received an education after the revolution and credits the revolution with his education, became an architect. He also maintains a strong Chinese identity. And so they shared their family history with me and walked me around the kind of dilapidated areas of Cienfuegos where all the Chinese institutions were boarded up. And since then, Blas Pelayo has been able to refurbish his grandfather's grave and highlighted the story of his grandfather, who came to the Spanish colony as a coolie, died there as a citizen of the Cuban Republic, a leader of the Chinese-Cuban community in Cienfuegos, and the patriarch of a mixed Chinese and African family. In 1993, China's President Jiang Zemin came to Havana, and this was a landmark visit. And Blas Pelayo wrote an essay to read in front of the Chinese community in Cuba. And in this essay, he compared the visit of Chen Lanbin to the Chinese current president, Jiang Zemin. Chen Lanbin was the Chinese official who had come in 1874 to investigate abuses in the coolie system. And so it was considered a positive event for the Chinese in Cuba. And Blas wrote in his essay, The moment is significantly emotional. The native at my side yells immediately in Cantonese, "Forever China," even though I don't know that language, perhaps out of ethnic instinct and solidarity. I repeat it in Spanish. During this visit, back in '99, I also met Mitzi Espinosa Luis, who immediately told me the story of her Chinese grandfather, Francisco Luis, and his 2 daughters in China, a story of Pacific migration, family, and separation. Mitzi also has always maintained a strong attachment to her Chinese heritage, and the revitalization process produced all of these events that anyone from across the island who had resources could come to. So she made her way from Cienfuegos to Havana for a Chinese New Year's celebration and met 2 elderly Chinese, Felipe and Santiago, who had the same surname, Luis, and they were from the same village. The 96-year-old Felipe, who was born in 1903, was about the same age as Mitzi's grandfather would have been. And after this followed a kind of fictive kinship between the 3 of them. And Felipe and Santiago came to consider Mitzi a granddaughter. In 2001, as I was beginning my field work for my dissertation, I embarked on a journey to try to locate Lui Fan's family in China. So these are the relatives that had been disconnected since 1975. I ended up meeting both of his Chinese daughters, Bao Qin and Ma Li, as well as their children and grandchildren. When I visited their house, I was amazed to find old photos of Francisco Luis and his Cuban daughters hanging on the wall, attesting to the endurance of this family connection throughout the years. So communication between the Chinese and Cuban sisters resumed after 2001, and this time the grandchildren took an active role in translating and sending email messages. Many Cuban youth, as you know, dream of going to the United States. But Mitzi Espinosa had always wanted to travel to China while growing up. In May of 2009, Mitzi's dream to meet her Chinese relatives became a reality. These are the 2 sisters in Cuba and in China. And they never actually met. In 2009, though, I was able to bring Mitzi to a conference in Guangzhou, which is Canton. And we hired a minivan and driver and descended upon Lui Village. And I have to say, we gave them very little notice that we were coming. But the whole extended family met us at the village gate. Francisco Luis's 2 Chinese daughters had unfortunately died since my last visit, but their husbands, children, and grandchildren gathered to meet us. They showered Mitzi with hongbao, which are the red envelopes that you give money to people with in Chinese tradition, questions that were filtered through Cantonese, Mandarin, and English back to Spanish, which was Mitzi's language. We visited Francisco Luis's ancestral home, and we found an old trunk filled with that had the initials FL on it, and the Chinese relatives said that they never knew what was in that trunk or what FL meant, because to them he was Lui Fan, and they would have identified it with Chinese characters. And Mitzi just looked and said, "Oh, Francisco Luis." So they were never really even aware of his name, the name that he used on a day-to-day basis in Cuba. And we opened up the trunk, and you can imagine it hadn't been opened since the 1930s. So it was a lot of dust and mostly old clothing, all of it Western-style clothing. And then at the family shrine, we noticed that the tablets included Lui Fan's Cuban children and grandchildren. So Mitzi's name had always been there on the family shrine in China. And so I think this story underscores the multiple identities that make up a Cuban in people such as the descendants, Mitzi Espinosa and Blas and Santiago Pelayo. And this is a story, I think, that is also to be continued. And along that note, I also want to mention a new project that I'm working on that also has to do with the diversity of the Cuban diaspora in history. So if any of you know people or have some experience, but know people of Chinese descent who are in the United States that you think would be willing to share their stories, I think this is really important to capture this before they go away. So thank you very much.